The St. Eugene's Mission near Cranbrook is one of the many historical sites throughout the Columbia River Basin. From valley to valley, the people of this region are unique, diverse, and have always been tied to the land. In the 1960s, decisions were made that greatly affected this region by the building of dams under the Columbia River Treaty. It's been over 30 years since those decisions were made, and they're having a profound effect again on the Columbia River Basin, but this time a more positive impact on the basin as a whole. Through the efforts of longtime basin residents, the Columbia Basin Trust was formed. The purpose of the trust is to build a financial foundation to create a legacy for present and future generations. Now let's take a look at how the Columbia Basin Trust evolved. The fact that the Columbia Basin Trust exists today is a credit to the resiliency and sense of fairness of the people and communities who are directly affected by dam construction. Through their strong connection to the land and the Columbia River, and their commitment to their communities and way of life, these self-sufficient people refused to let go of a dream. Their dream was that the region that was most affected by dam construction would someday directly benefit from the wealth generated by the treaty dams. A generation after the signing of the Columbia River Treaty, they established the Columbia River Treaty Committee and sought the support of their neighbors and regional governments to make their dream a reality. They worked for the establishment of a trust funded by downstream benefits from the Columbia River Treaty and controlled by the people of the basin. The trust is to provide a legacy of social, environmental, and economic benefits to the region now and in the future. With the support of the provincial government, they were successful. Their achievement is already bringing direct benefits to the region through the investment and spending activities of the trust.
It's difficult to judge decisions that were made 30 years ago in regards to the Columbia River Treaty by today's standards. Certainly, the decision to go ahead and actually sign the treaty with the United States and build the treaty projects within British Columbia that flooded the regions, the valleys that we hold so dear, had great economic benefit for the province as a whole. The difficulty is that the legacy that was left to the people of the Columbia Kootenay region and the basin as a whole certainly has never been dealt with. And that is now starting to happen with the Columbia Basin Trust.
In 1961, the Columbia River Treaty was signed, paving the way for dams to be constructed in Canada and the United States. This resulted in lands being flooded, homes, communities, livelihoods, and valuable resources being lost. Fish and wildlife habitats were destroyed, and farmland and harvestable forest disappeared. In addition to the Mica, Keenly Side, and Duncan dams being constructed in Canada, the Americans built the Libby Dam in Montana. In total, thousands of hectares of land in southeastern BC was flooded.
This is really why I'm here now. It was the most fertile farm in the whole of British Columbia, I would say. Prior to the flooding in 1967, it gave us a very steady income, and we had a wonderful, happy life here, which came to an end with the building of the High Era Dam.
The dams provide flood control mainly during the high spring runoffs, but the main reason is to create reservoirs for water storage and use this water to run over turbines to generate electricity when needed. This means the reservoirs are drawn down, especially during the cold winter months, and filled during the summer. This also means the reservoirs are constantly fluctuating for most of the year. Using these reservoirs for tourism is almost impossible.
The lifestyle in the areas of the reservoirs are affected every day by the rise and fall of the reservoir. We have lost agricultural land and forestry land, but we also have to deal in our area particularly with a rise and fall of 70 feet. And so to build a permanent a resort or permanent homes or features on the reservoir, we have to deal with that every day. Through that rise and fall, we also have dust storms and those types of things that we have to deal with that has become our lifestyle, part of our lifestyle now. But people come here still for the natural beauty that we have. And we have to be appreciative of that, even and as well as living with how the reservoirs have affected us.
When the treaty was originally signed, the province of British Columbia received about $67 million US for flood control benefits. They also received approximately $260 million US from a group of US utilities, by which the electricity that was created as Canadian stored water flowed over US dams was sold in the United States. The Columbia River Treaty Committee was aware that that term of the original sale of electricity, which was 30 years, was about to expire, and wanted to ensure that in any renegotiated downstream benefit or sale of that electricity, that the region would receive a benefit from that as well.
Some of the people of the basin saw the start of downstream benefit payments as their opportunity to repay the losses of the past. They came from the 5 regional districts in the basin, the Kootenay Tribal Council, and the 5 MLAs. Together in 1992, they formed the Columbia River Treaty Committee. Their goal was to gain a share of the downstream benefits money by having it paid directly to a trust that was controlled by the people of the basin.
To start with, it was $5,000 that they put up the first year, and to fund the Columbia River Treaty and Committee. And within a year, actually, they increased that, and the next year they had it to put $15,000 per regional government. So here now they were up already to $20,000 with no guarantees that they were going to get anything back. And if you remember, the Central Kootenay already had spent a lot of money trying to get BC Hydro taxation. So this was another venture that went on, but except this was different in that all of the regional governments joined, and that's what really made it successful. Certainly having the 5 regional districts pulling together and then having the Kootenay Tribal Council join that group was definitely a key to our success, along with the MLAs who also started to push the government.
Well, when the Columbia Basin Trust Act came before the legislature, it didn't really matter what political party you were. Everybody kind of stood back and looked at the thing and thought, this is a novel idea. And then we debated it not with rancor, but with history and cause and effect. And why is this happening? Will it work? Is it a good idea? Where will the funding come from? All those questions, but not the usual partisan opposition. I think in the end, I think maybe one person voted against it.
The purpose of the Columbia Basin Trust is to return the wealth generated by the Columbia River Treaty's downstream benefits to the people of the basin in the form of social, economic, and environmental benefits by understanding this unique area and the diverse cultures.
In all true justice, the DSBs must come back to the affected area, and nothing else will satisfy the people of this region.
Before the trust was formed, the Columbia River Treaty Committee held 3 symposiums and many public meetings to gather people's ideas about how the trust should be structured and the principles and purposes which would guide its activities. These ideas were set out in the Columbia Basin Trust Act and guide the activities of the trust today.
Today we have the Columbia Basin Trust enshrined in legislation with a mandate so that we can tap the vitality and the creativity of this region, and we can make long-term plans to invest in the social, economic, and environmental well-being of this region and of the people that live here.
Hello, neighbors. I like to start these with neighbors because we're building a construct here about neighbors that extends far further than a lot of other neighborhoods have been before. And there's such a big power in an idea, and we're building an idea here in this thing. So I'd like to talk a little bit about this. First, I'd like to say thank you for all of you people who've committed to this idea. The idea that a group of people can be tied to a river and tied to each other through that river. That is a powerful, powerful thing that in my mind will outlast and outpower anything. And we've proved that just through the idea of governments and all different kinds of people coming together, and the strength of tying ourselves to a piece of land has been a phenomenally powerful negotiating point.
it isn't really about laws or budgets or the expenditure of money or investments. It's about some kind of legacy, and the legacy has to do with some kind of empowerment. If you can actually turn over resources, power generation capacity, to the people, and then a generation grows up who thinks of themselves as the source of power, thinks about their community as the owner of the wealth, it seems to me the sky is the limit on what the next generation of citizens of the Columbia Basin might do with this entity, and what they might do with the wealth or the water or the power that is theirs because of the decisions of a previous generation.
To me, a trust is a legacy that does two things in my mind, or has two major things. The first one is that it is owned and it is directed by its trustees. Us collectively, owned and directed by its trustees. And secondly, is financially and structurally stable. If it's stable, if it's got money, if its organizations are stable and it's owned and it's directed by its trustees, then in my mind it starts to get to be a trust.
In July 1995, the Columbia Basin Trust Act was passed in the legislature. Together, the Columbia Basin Act and the binding agreement describe the trust purpose and set out the money the trust will receive from the province as its share of downstream benefits.
An important feature of the Columbia Basin Trust Act is that it puts control of the assets of the trust in the hands of residents of the basin. The Act provides for the appointment to the Board of Directors, 18 Board of Directors, from the 5 regional districts, each appointing 2 members to the board, from the Tunaka-Kinbasket Tribal Council, also appointing 2 members, and then the remaining 6 members are appointed by the province. So all of those people are required by the legislation to be residents of the basin. And that's where the control is exercised over the organization.
According to the binding agreement, the trust will receive from the province $250 million over 10 years for power project investments, a one-time regional allocation of downstream benefits of $45 million, and $32 million in operating funds spread out over 16 years. The first annual payment of $2 million for operating was received in August 1995, thus allowing the Columbia Basin Trust the means to develop a plan on the return of monetary benefits to the residents of the basin. This planning stage started with a symposium at Golden in October 1995.
And start us off on a track of development which takes us from the philosophizing that we did 3 years ago to the development of some very practical results that we can generate now.
Now that we have the monies in the bank, we must, and I know we will, as a basin folks, stay together and spend that money, or bank that money, spend the interest, whatever decisions are made wisely, because we know the decisions that the trusts of the day make in the years to come is something that our children and their children would live with. So I know it will be a very interesting weekend as we get input from the people throughout the basin as to direction to the board and how they make the decisions for the generations to come.
In 1996, the Board of Directors hired the Trust's first staff and established an office in Nakusp, one of the communities directly affected by dam construction. As required by the Act, an interim advisory committee was selected to provide ongoing public input on the planning process. One of the first tasks for this new organization was to consult with the people of the region to develop a long-term plan for how the assets of the Trust could be managed as a legacy to bring social, economic, and environmental benefits to the area. The Act required that such a plan be approved by the Board in public by July 1997, a short 2 years after the Trust was established.
Right from its inception, from the days of the Columbia River Treaty Committee and through the formation of the Columbia Basin Trust, a lot of emphasis has been put on the importance of public input. There have been 4 public symposiums, the last 2 under the auspices of the Trust since it was formed in July of 1995. These are important gatherings of people from right across the basin to provide guidance to the Trust, first of all in the formation of the legislation, and more recently in the formation of the Columbia Basin Management Plan.
I'm very impressed with the draft management plan. It's thorough and it's thoughtful, and after reading it I'm excited about what I see. The first then is to involve people in planning social, economic and environmental improvements in the Canadian Columbia River Basin, again in a way that's never been done before. And this is a pragmatic exercise as I see it, and I'm convinced it's going to yield positive benefits for the river basin and the people who live here.
The completed Columbia Basin Management Plan was adopted by the board in July 1997. It contains investment and spending goals for the Trust.
It's important to the board of directors of the Columbia Basin Trust that the public has input into how we're going to operate over the next years and how the public will receive some of the benefits as a result of the Columbia Basin Trust Act. The benefits will come back through a basin plan, and that plan has been made up with a great amount of public participation. It was really important because 30 years ago the public didn't get any opportunities at all to say what was going to happen in these valleys. And I know as local politicians we had spoken and said we didn't want to come back and say, well, 30 years ago you didn't get any input, but boy do we have a deal for you today. We wanted to make certain that the public had key input and gave all the direction that was required for the trust board to operate. We see ourselves as trustees in the true sense of the word, trying to look after the public direction. And that direction came to us from symposiums, outreach programs, and some of the public direction, I'm just going to paraphrase a few, and that is to look at some of the natural resources in this region and to ensure that the fish and wildlife are restored, that some of the communities that were first affected are the first ones to receive some benefit. That was obviously a large concern by many of the symposium delegates throughout the 3 or 4 symposiums that we've already held. That economic development was a key factor for this region, and that good jobs that would support with wages that would support families in this region was important. And that youth have an opportunity to actually stay in this region, that they don't have to go to the coast or they don't have to go to Alberta in order to find jobs. Also, there's an advocacy role the Trust is going to be looking at, and that is how do we deal with some of the long-standing issues that have never been resolved. And we also heard very strongly that the ability for this region to be self-sufficient, to be able to look after themselves, is very important.
I've listened to many of the discussions going on in the plenary sessions, and I've been involved in some of the discussions that led up to the symposium. And while everyone, I think, has been very open and honest in their discussions and so on, I think what I've seen is it's very difficult for many of us to look beyond our projects and our communities. And I really have to say it's been incredibly refreshing to work with this group of people who put aside, right from the start, their projects, their ideas, their communities, and were willing to focus in all of their discussions on the basin as a whole and what they felt was good for the youth of the basin as a whole, as opposed to their own communities and so on.
I'm addressing the issues that the youth have come up with, the ones that concern us the most. If we develop an understanding of the basin socially, environmentally, it's a big one, and economically, we will be able to develop a caring for the basin and therefore be able to manage it better for the future. We need to learn about the basin, the ecosystems. We want to stay in the basin area. We're concerned for the environment, and we feel the need to add value to resources, to keep natural resources here and not export them.
You need community pride. You have to keep sharing and caring about this is your area, like this is what you have to work with. Stress historical events that had happened. Let people in your community know like what has happened before. And you also really, the big thing is to keep the youth involved. These are your future, and if you respect them, we will respect you in return. Thank you.
The investment program will manage the Trust's assets as a legacy and ensure that the Trust becomes a financially self-sufficient corporation capable of delivering these benefits in the long term. It will generate broad secondary economic benefits for the basin community from the Trust's investments. The binding agreement between the Trust and the province provides the Trust with money for power project investments. The Trust also receives a regional share of downstream benefits and operating funds. The Trust will invest these monies to generate income for spending projects over the long term. Over the next 10 years, the Trust will receive $295 million to invest in the basin. 85% of this capital is tied to power project investments.
It's an important feature of the Act that the monies transferred to the Trust by the province come in the form of endowment capital. That is, the monies are for investment purposes, not for spending purposes. That means that the Trust cannot support its spending programs until it has earned revenues from its investments. And I think this is a very good discipline for the Trust. It has to invest wisely if it's going to have enough money to spend. And investing wisely means that we have to use the best of private sector practices to make sure the returns on that capital which has been entrusted to us is adequate for the purposes.
People have asked why would the Trust want to be involved in investing in power projects when they are in fact what created some of the major problems in this region in the past. Well, a good example will be that power projects are going to stay here as long as the damage that was caused by the concrete that flooded our lands will be here. And by investing in those projects, we can ensure that we'll have a long-term rate of return or funds to deal with some of the impacts. And not only that, the Trust can be involved in the decisions regarding water management and what happens in this region as a result of being at the table when decisions on power, on water levels, on our future are being held. A good example of that is one of the first investments the Columbia Basin Trust made in conjunction with their partner, the Columbia Power Corporation, is to invest in the Brilliant Power Project, which is built in about 1943. That project, by the Trust investing in it, will see a rate of return over the next 60 years of about 11.5%. But it also ensured that the low cost of electricity created at this project will continue to come back to Basin residents forever.
As its first power project investment, the Trust now owns the Brilliant Dam in partnership with the Columbia Power Corporation, which represents the provincial interests. The dam is already generating income for the Trust under a 60-year guaranteed power sales agreement with West Kootenay Power.
The Trust, somewhat different than I had pictured it. I never pictured that we would be in the dam construction and dam operation business, but in terms of the future, it probably has more opportunities for the Trust than even just getting a downright grant every year from the government.
Another example of the Trust being able to have some influence in what happens in future developments in this region regarding power is our investment in Kinleyside. By investing in Kinleyside, we can also influence how those investments will occur. And the good examples of that will be ensuring that as many people as we can from the region get hired on that project, so we're not bringing an outside workforce in. We also want to make certain that we have the opportunity to bring on youth and apprenticeship programs to meet our needs, because Kinleyside is just the first in a series of developments that we hope to be doing, which includes as well a redevelopment at this site at Brilliant and Juanita. In the past year or so, the Columbia Basin Trust and the Columbia Power Corporation have been taking Kinleyside Power Project through an environmental assessment. We want to make certain that we bring a project online that is environmentally sensitive and takes care of all the issues in a way that we don't have to compensate for fish, but rather we cure the issues on the power project before they occur. Recently signed sales contracts with BC Hydro that will ensure that the power at that new facility will be sold to BC Hydro and stay within the province of British Columbia.
In addition to power project investments, it is the goal of the Trust to continue to actively search for ways to invest in regionally based enterprises and support the development of small business. An example is through equity opportunity. As well as employment, the workforce will be trained through apprenticeship programs. The investment will stimulate the economy and create jobs. Locally based investments will earn income for the Trust spending program. These benefit programs are now being delivered according to the principles set out in the Columbia Basin Management Plan.
Within the Trust Act itself, we have a mandate to try to bring some social, economic, and environmental benefits back to the people of the region and back to the basin that's been affected by the Columbia River Treaty. And that's a pretty broad mandate. We also have within our mandate to do planning, to involve the public in setting that direction. How are we going to bring those benefits back to the people? And in all honesty, this more from a personal perspective, I'm not. My favorite thing is not to do planning. I'm more of a doer than a planner. But as we've gone through quite an extensive public participation process, it's been quite evident that it's been a very important process in order to get the public's direction. And we have had one of the most successful programs in talking and getting information from the public, involving the public. And with that type of input, with that type of support from the people of this region and the enthusiasm as to what they see for their future in this region, that's really what we've created with the Columbia Basin Plan. That is direction directly from the people, and that's what is going to make it such an important document for today and for the future.
The vision of the people of the basin is being realized. People wanted the suffering caused by dam construction to be recognized and wanted a share of the downstream benefits. They wanted this money to be placed in the care of a trust controlled by basin residents and managed as a legacy to improve the well-being of the basin and for all its residents in the long term. They wanted to be consulted and to participate in setting the goals and objectives of the trust. All these are now in place, and the trust is ready to serve the people of the basin. Our future success depends on remembering the past and on our continued ability to work and learn together, to think basin-wide and make creative use of the magnificent natural resources of the region, to create healthy, self-sufficient communities and vibrant, naturally functioning ecosystems. In the end, we will build a new basin culture by continuing to value people, community, and self-sufficiency, and by working together to add value to the region's resources and the Trust's legacy. It will be interesting to stand here 30 years from now and see what positive impacts the Columbia Basin Trust has had through the efforts of the Trust, communities, groups, and individuals of the Columbia River Basin.